Wigwusin, Natoma Kanitampag. Good day, family and friends. Neesu Wushuwunoag, Director General, the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. I hope that this video finds you all safe and healthy, given everything that's going on. A lot of stuff happening in society, and interesting. Just paying attention to how things are going, and at the potential of what things could be. Um, haven't been on in a while, as usual. Usually only come on when there's something pertinent or that we feel is necessary to be said. Other than that, um, feel like there's been some good information that's been put out there to pretty much get anyone who's earnestly seeking on the right track in terms of identifying who they are and understanding how the law applies um, to your status or standing as an American Indian. And that's really the subject of this afternoon's video, the American Indian. We did a video a while back on the difference between American Indians and Moors, just kind of laying out why it's incorrect to call all American Indians Moors. We're not saying that there aren't some tribes that had relationships with Moors or individuals that might have American Indian and Moorish heritage. Yeah, everyone's story is their own story. But it's incorrect to say that all Indians are Moors. And from time to time, we see messages from different people kind of arguing from what it seems to be a general misunderstanding of what an American Indian is. So today we're just going to go ahead and break down what the American Indian is and the different classifications of it and how they tie in or how the status is substantiated. Um, and it looks like there's about five, maybe six, depending upon how you look at one of them. I'm going to lump them together as one. So I'm going to say five statuses of American Indian as we understand it at the time being. Um, so let's get into it. First of all, just a little understanding of what the American Indian is. Just in short term language, it's an aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas at the time of discovery by Columbus. And I'll put definitions down in the comment section so you can see the Ballentine versus the Black's Law. But that's generally what an American Indian was understood to be and is understood to be now when the term became adopted into law and popularized and all that good stuff. So it's a generic term, and it just means anyone that's an Aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas at the time that Columbus discovered. Um, but it's also tribally based, and that's that's how they knew people were Indians. They didn't bring them here. They didn't come here. They were here, and if you were here, you were operating in some sort of tribal fashion based upon family heritage or, um, proximity to living to each other. So those are the main things. Generic term, Aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas, is tribally based. Um, Secondly, at the time of the U.S. Constitution, Indians were not considered citizens. They were outside the body politic of the U.S. And did not become citizens until the Snyder Act of 1924 officially. However, this was conferred upon them. It wasn't something that individual tribes were asking for collectively. So what it did actually with the Snyder Act of 1924 is give Indians a dual citizenship status under U.S. law. One is a U.S. citizen, the other as a tribal citizen of their particular nation. Now, the issue that a lot of Indians have, probably why you've been watching these videos, probably why you're interested in knowing more about who you are, is that most Indians are not operating in any dual citizenship capacity. They're just a U.S. citizen. And why is that? Well, because their tribe doesn't exist commercially. And this is all commercial. All of these laws, all of it, when you break it all down, it's commercial because it's about land rights. It's about what someone can or can't do to you and what the penalty will be. But when you're talking over here, it's primarily based in commercial law. So when they say that your tribe doesn't exist, they don't mean that you're not in the flesh and blood here. It means that commercially, the people that you're saying you're related to don't exist. And that's why you have to be specific about which particular people you're related to, and which why claiming to be just a generic American Indian isn't going to really be legitimate. You need to know who you are. So, quickly want to look at just some of the statuses of what tribes can be, and then this will all relate to the status of an American Indian. So, a tribe can be in the commercial capacity of non-existent. That means, you know, you and your family, you know who you are, but that's it. You know who you are. You're just a U.S. citizen. There's no commercial or lawful basis by which you exist anywhere else that says that you are who you are in a separate jurisdiction from the U.S. So you're an American Indian. And that's what happens when we get into the status for the first few. But your tribe's non-existent. Secondly, your tribe can be a domestic corporation, and there are tribes out there that have gone to 501c3 route and things of that nature. But when you do that, your tribe is then subject to all U.S. laws. So that's state and federal. So you're not going to have any treaty rights that you're going to be exercising if you're a domestic corporation. You'll exist, but it'll be in a just like any other U.S. Company. You just be U.S. citizens with a U.S. company. Then there are tribes that are operating through a recognition relationship with the U.S., be that state or federal. And with those tribes, there's going to be a number of criteria that they're going to be looking for, much of which FANA has built its criteria based upon with an addition. But this isn't specific to anyone. These are just the general things that they're going to be looking for. Aboriginal and historical ties to specific ancestral territories. So when you're talking about tribes, they're usually looking for the specific place where the tribe is from and an historical tie to that place. So you didn't move off and go somewhere else and then you found out who you are and now you're pointing back to where you're from. They want to see that you maintain relationships with there. So you're specific to there. You're not just this generic Indian sort of thing. You're specific to here. These are who your particular people are. Aboriginal and historic ties to specific ancestral lands. Then they're going to be looking at your tribal body. Is it primarily of direct blood descendants of the people you're claiming to be? So they don't want to see that your chief is, but then everyone else is a bunch of Indians, generic Indians. That's not. Is it your family? And that's why you've always heard FANA push family, family. You need to know who your family is. You need to know what your family history is. You need to know what your narrative is. Because that other criteria is going to be your tribal body being primarily those people, not you and your family and then everyone else. You're all primarily those people when you go back and find out what your narrative or your experience is. And then they're going to look at, have you maintained a documented presence in your area? And this is where the importance of genealogy and things of that nature comes in. Doing research, finding documents, finding records, finding, all of the different things that people who are engaged with the system create in order to function in the system. Remember, all Indians are U.S. citizens at this point. All Indians are U.S. citizens, but they enjoy a dual citizenship if they understand the laws correctly. So a maintained and documented presence in those specific territories that you're saying you're from. And once again, not that you're from there a while ago, hundreds of years ago, but that you've maintained some sort of presence or relationship with that, and that it's documented. And everything's documented. Everything, because it's all commercial, so they document everything. If they were going to take something from you, they're going to have a paper trail to show that they took it from you, because they want to be able to go and do whatever they're going to do with it after. And it's all about paper and records and all of that. So maintain a documented presence. Then they're going to be looking for you to have a functioning tribal governance. So how long have your chief been your chief? How long have you all been organized? All of those things are going to come into place. And for a lot of communities out there and tribes out there, you're going to have people who they've been doing this since the 1700s, 1800s, 1600s in some places, definitely 1900s. So they're looking at that as well. And, um, that's why we encourage going and finding and building relationships with tribes that are there, because they're going to have a much stronger claim than you do if they've had a functioning tribal governance for a while, in whatever structure that is. Most of the FANA nations, all of them, operate under traditional forms, with clans and tribes and things of that nature. So, but a functioning tribal governance, and then this is always key: acknowledgement from other tribes. And yeah, if you're in an area, even if we're not even talking about federal and state recognition, we're talking about being in an area, being around other tribes. And I know up here in the New England areas, there's a lot of tribes who just aren't federally recognized, aren't state recognized. But the other tribes around know that they're tribes. Regardless of what their relationship is with the system, the other tribes around know that they're tribes. So if you're in an area and no other tribes know your tribe, you've never been to any of their functions, they've never been to any of yours, you've never engaged in any culture, you just pop up out of nowhere, you're going to be in a bit of a pickle because there's tribes around. You might just not have heard of them, but there's tribes around. And if you understand the community and if you understand the relationships and how traditional Indians engage with each other, it's not hard to find them. Someone will point you in the direction of them. So acknowledgement from other tribes, and then there's another element that fauna adds on as well, which I'm not going to really get into here, but those are five: Aboriginal historical ties to specific ancestral lands, tribal body of direct blood descendants, a maintained and documented presence, a functioning tribal governance, and then acknowledgement from other tribes that are around in your areas. If you don't have them, your tribe's going to really be not looked at as legitimate, I would say. Um, it might be considered a band if you got a bunch of different Indians together from different places. They have intertribal councils and things of that nature. A lot of times in urban areas, it might be looked at as a group, you know, um, and that's cool. All of these things are cool because, especially if you're looking to have a community and to be engaged in the culture or learn from other cultures or share cultures, all of that's beautiful. We're talking specifically from a tribal perspective, though. So you have those things that go on, but they're not necessarily going to meet the standard of a tribe. And when we are talking about the American Indian, this is why it's important to understand that there are different statuses and standings under this title of American Indian based upon the breakdown of tribes I just gave you. So because there's tribes in different statuses, you're going to have American Indians that are in different statuses. And you need to understand what your status is if you are indeed an American Indian. And most particularly, if you're planning to claim to be an American Indian. And most certainly, you want to stay away from it if you haven't substantiated that you are actually from a tribe that's based in what I just shared with you. Now, let's turn our attention in the remainder of our time here, from the understanding of the tribe to the American Indian. Remember, generic term. It's an Aboriginal habitant of the Americas, and it's tribal based. And I just broke down what tribes are. At the time of the U.S. Constitution, Indians were not citizens, but under the Snyder Act, they became citizens. It was conferred upon them, but they maintained a dual citizenship status. And the issue with a lot of American Indians out there is that they can't exercise their dual citizen status because their tribe doesn't exist. Or if it does exist, it exists. Well, yeah, their tribe doesn't exist, or it's particularly existing in a domestic status. So turning back over to this American Indian, the first status you're going to have, and I think that this is where a lot of people are at, is the misclassified American Indian. These are the ones who, have been able to document that their people were American Indians that were reclassified over to Negro, reclassified over to white, reclassified over to African American, colored, whatever the case may be. They're able to show that they were American Indians and that they were misclassified. Now, this is why it's important. You have to be able to find the American Indian side of things, because there were also African slaves, East Asian slaves, Atlantic Creoles, and Moors that were also reclassified to Negro. So it's not just this thing that if you have Negro on a document, you're automatically an Indian. It means you got lumped in, you got misclassified, and now you need to find out who you actually are. So you have that first status of misclassified American Indians. And because they're misclassified, they're most certainly not associated with any particular tribe. So their status is just a U.S. citizen. And we all know this. This is where everyone talks about the term black and I'm a copper colored. And that's why even the copper colored, because you're still misclassified. You're still just a U.S. citizen. Even if you are a copper colored aborigine, an autochthonous, you're just a U.S. citizen. That's what your status is, because there's no relationship with anything else other than the U.S. And your status is just your classification in the U.S. And all American Indians are U.S. citizens. So even if you are a copper-colored aborigine, you're still a U.S. citizen, just like a black person, an African American, a Latino. You're going to be like them. And this also goes for our rural and urban Indians. Now, what's interesting about the rural and urban, and I'm lumping them all into one, they could be two separate categories because rural areas are much different than urban areas. But I'm saying rural or urban, they could be tribal citizens. Now, that means they could be associated. A lot of individuals, you run into people say, well, I know that my family was Cherokee, or I know that my family was Lenape. I know that my family was whatever your family might potentially be. They may be living in urban areas or rural areas, but not associated with any tribe, in which case they're going to be like our misclassified or U.S. citizens. They're going to be American Indians, but they're going to be U.S. citizens. Just like our misclassified, they're going to be U.S. citizens. They're going to be American Indians, but they're going to be U.S. citizens. And they don't have any dual status because they just know their heritage. But the point being is, in order to even make that claim on any of them, you have to know what your blood heritage is. And that's where the American Indian status comes from, your blood heritage. Now, rural and urban Indians also may have connections to their tribe, but they're not living on the reservation. They're off the reservation, so they're going to be considered rural or urban. So in this case, they're going to be both statuses, whether you do have the connection with the tribe or don't have the connection with the tribe. You're a non-reservation Indian. So you're just a U.S. citizen. Because if you're not on a reservation, but you're a U.S. citizen, then you're under U.S. law. If you're not on a reservation and you're a U.S. citizen. And remember, all Indians are U.S. citizens, regardless. So now, let's move on to this next status. This next status is going to be state recognized. And once again, this is tribal based. However, the status of tribe, being that it's in the recognized category, is going to be that of a domestic dependent nation of the U.S. So that means that they are, have the history. They meet all of the criteria that are there. They're probably also acknowledged in treaties and things of that nature. A lot of state recognized tribes are the tribes that are acknowledged in treaties and things of that nature. And it's going to be by blood heritage once again. You're from those people that signed those treaties, that were in these lands, that are documented in these lands as being these people, and this is your chief, and all of that's going to be going on. But they're going to be domestic dependents, and they're going to be in the status of reservation Indians. So when they're off reservation, they're under U.S. law and all that good stuff. But when they're on reservation, they're under whatever agreement they have with the state that they're in. And most of these are going to be pre-U.S. because the U.S. at a point when it started designated all of that to Congress. So once the U.S. starts, that's where you're going to have a lot of the federal tribes, definitely. But before the U.S. starts, it's primarily going to be the tribes that have that colonial era heritage acknowledged in treaties. However, if they are state recognized, then they're going to be having a dual citizenship status, but it's going to be a recognized status, which means on the reservation, they have their rights. Off the reservation, they're subject to the laws as they pertain to the state that they're in. So that's a state recognition. And usually they're treated by law, I think, as a county. I think they're considered counties under U.S. law of the state, counties of the state, if they're state recognized. And remember, U.S. citizen tied to treaty rights. and all of those criteria, and it's by blood heritage, and these are reservation Indians. Next, you have your federally recognized Indians, and the same sort of thing, but their relationship is coming with the feds, with the U.S. government. They may have access to treaty rights, but then they also agreed to a recognition relationship with the U.S., or they could be under the BIA sort of relationship where you just have it with the BIA on behalf of the U.S. That's going to be based on blood heritage as well. They may have access to treaty rights, and they are going to be the dual citizen, but only on the reservation, and then once again subject to whatever those federal relationships are while they're on the reservation. So whatever the jurisdiction is there, and once again they're going to be considered domestic dependent nations. Those are going to be domestic dependent nations. They're underneath the U.S. They're like state recognized, so they're underneath the U.S. They're political entities within the U.S., but they're under U.S. jurisdiction. Those first four right there, misclassified, rural, state recognized, and federal recognized, are all going to be subject to U.S. law. All of them. Misclassified, rural, urban. So if you're copper-colored Aborigine, if you're autochthonous, if you're American Indian, if you're American Aborigine, whatever one you are, if you're not associated with the tribe, then you're under U.S. law. And if you are associated with the tribe, but it's state or federal recognized, you're under U.S. law. So you're all under U.S. law in these first four categories. And in the last two, you may have different rights when you're on the reservation, or different rights in the particular state based upon the relationship that your people have. But that only comes through the status and relationship that your people, the tribe, have. Those are the four: misclassified, rural and urban, state recognized, federally recognized. And now we're going to move on to our fifth one. And this is what we did videos on this before, but we just want to clarify once again. Under this status of American Indian is the status of Indian not taxed. And this is the only status that really is operating properly, from our understanding, in the dual citizenship status. What an Indian is not taxed is once again, it's tribal based through blood heritage. So if you are not in relationships with the tribe, if you're not on any sort of formal governance, then you're not an Indian not taxed. And this comes right out of the 1860 Census Instructions, which said that Indians not taxed are not to be enumerated. Indians that had renounced tribal rule. So as soon as you're not under a tribe, you've renounced tribal rule. Were under state or territorial law and exercise rights of citizens under state or territorial law were considered assimilated and were to be enumerated. They were enumerated because they had assimilated. So if you don't have ties to a tribe, if you haven't done your blood heritage, you're an assimilated American Indian and you've been enumerated. You're part of the U.S. So there's no exercising any rights associated with an Indian not taxed. So if that's the Indians who are to be enumerated, then the ones that are not to be enumerated, the Indians not taxed, and this is by the 1860 Census Directions, are within tribal rule and not exercising rights of citizenships or territories under those laws. So if you have a birth certificate, if you have driver's license, anything that citizens have the rights to do, not benefits or entitlements, but rights to do, voting. If you're doing any of these things, if you have any of these things, you are a citizen, U.S. citizen. The Indian not taxed is going to exist in a space outside of that, solely outside of that, originated in that space. But you can only do that when you can show that that status existed before the U.S. got here, before the state got here, before the colony got here. If you can't show that, then you can't prove that you're an Indian, and you most certainly can't prove that you're an Indian not taxed. You can't prove that you're an Indian if the blood's not there, if the genealogy is not there. If your narrative specifically and personally is not there, then you're not an Indian not taxed. And there's nothing wrong with not being, not an American Indian. And there's nothing wrong with not being an American Indian. What's your heritage? What is your experience? What is your relationship with here? But if you're going to be an Indian, you have to be an Indian. You have to have the blood. You have to tie back to the tribe. And you can't be just a U.S. citizen claiming to be an American Indian, talking about exercising rules, rights, anything outside of U.S. law. You don't have it. Any of that comes, once again, from the relationship that the tribe has with the U.S. And for an Indian not tax status, that status of the 5 that I identified here, and it could be more, the 5 that I identified here, um, 4 of them are directly under U.S. law. Directly under U.S. law. You could be a super full-blood Indian, and you're still under U.S. law. It's all about your tribe's relationship with the U.S. And what the FANA member nations have is relationships that predate the U.S. and that were sovereign to sovereign with colonial powers. So because the tribe is tied to sovereign colonial powers, and because the blood members are descendant from those people who were involved in that, then there's rights now to say that our tribes exist outside of the U.S. We were here before the U.S. We are those very people that you're speaking about when you talk about those tribes. That's us. You're talking about us. So that gives the tribal citizens of the FANA member nations a different status of American Indian. It's nothing to do with them as individuals. It's about their relationship with their tribe and who they collectively are comprised to be. So when I say I'm the Meshipag from Pumham Sachem of the Meshipag Nahigansett tribe, it's because my bloodlines are in the Meshipag territory for forever. My uncle was a chief up there. His father, my 4th great grandfather, was a chief. So it's all there. His grandfathers were chiefs. So it's all going back, continuing the same form of tribal governance that has been going on in these specific lands, documented in the records that we are those people, acknowledged by the tribes that are around us that we are those people. Regardless of the infighting that goes on, regardless, we are those people. That's where the Indian not tax status comes from. It's nothing to do with me as an individual. It's the fact that I'm a part of this tribe. And this tribe has not agreed to any recognition relationship, any domestic form of existence, but does exist commercially in an international space. That's what gives to me an Indian not tax status. That's what gives to any of the other FANA member nations an Indian not tax status, their relationship with their tribe. So it's all good. It's so wonderful that everyone's getting into their heritage and into their culture. Those are basic things that everyone should be doing anyway. We should all know who our people are and where they come from. It's a colonized outcome that most of us don't know that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't. That doesn't mean it's not what is expected and considered the norm. It just means that we've been deprived of that general right to know who you are. So it's so wonderful that people are getting into that. But what we don't want anyone doing is, as you come into this knowledge, to move as if you have a full understanding if you don't. We're seeing a lot of it with this American Indian term. You're not an Indian not taxed unless you're in some sort of relationship with a tribe. You're not a federally recognized or state recognized if you're not in some sort of relationship with the tribe. It's tribal based. And if you but are living off a reservation, then you're most likely, unless you're an Indian not taxed, you're going to be under U.S. law. And if you don't have any relationship, just the heritage, then you're most certainly under U.S. law, regardless of what you call yourself. It's not about what you call yourself. It's about what your ties are to your particular tribe and what that tribe's relationship is with the U.S. And that's why we say there's no sense in going and starting new tribes. You're going to miss out on a lot of those elements that we mentioned, and you're not going to be considered legitimate. And then you're going to be saying that you don't have to do things under U.S. law, and you do, and you're going to get yourself in trouble. You're going to get yourself in trouble. That's how you end up on Black identity experiment lists, sovereign lists, all of that. You're going to get yourself in trouble if you are not paying attention and understanding the different statuses, their relationship with the U.S. law, and what your particular claim is. And it's all particular and personal. There are no we claims. There are no generic us, us copper colored, us black folk, us, us, us. There is no us. Who are you? And who are you and your people? And potentially, maybe if you know your lines and I know my lines, we see that they meet up somewhere. So then maybe we're the same. But that's specific to us. We ain't all the same because we have the same skin tone, hair texture, physical attributes. That does not mean that we're the same people. It means right now, I guess you could say that we're having a similar experience in a nation that judges people based off of that. But colorism is a form of racism, and racism to be decolonizing. So as you move into this space, as you learn more about the American Indian status, as you go into your heritage, don't just stop willy-nilly playing around with laws. Understand, if we're decolonizing, it means we're going back to how things were before colonization started. And in these lands, I won't talk about anyone else's lands. In these lands, there was tribes, there was chiefdoms, there was all of these different things that were hierarchical structures based upon people's heritage and who they were related to and all of that stuff. So for decolonizing, pay attention and understand and make sure that you're applying it appropriately. So that's just that. The different statuses of American Indian. You got your misclassified, your rural/urban, your state, your federal, and then your Indian not taxed. These are going to be based specifically on your relationship with your tribe and its relationship with the now U.S. And remember, American Indian is just a generic term. It's just a generic term. Your specific type of American Indian is what's going to inform you of what your relationship is with the U.S. and what rights you have under the law. So hope that's helpful. Hope that's informative. And hoping everyone is just staying safe during everything that what's going on. We always like to say, I attach to all the warriors that are out there. Stand up for what's right. It's always the right time to do the right thing. Don't ever think that you need to wait to do the right thing. And may Creator continue to watch over and guide us all through these very tumultuous times. Akwani, Nataoma Kanitampag. Peace be unto you, family and friends. Peace Kanash. I hope to see you all soon. I hope. Wuni nakan nitampag kanataomag askatasquamson. It's very nice to be back. I know it's been a while. Had a lot going on. But as every time I have the opportunity to bring good words of encouragement and share some knowledge with you all, it's always a blessing. So we thank Creator for it. My people's title for the Creator was the Katantuit, Great Spirit from the Southwest, from which all spirits come and to which all spirits must return. That was the title they gave to Creator. So we thank Creator above, the Creator of all, just for the opportunity to be speaking. It is Neesu Wushuwunoag, Director General for the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. And I hope that this message finds you well this evening. Wanted to touch base and just share some updates. Keep our ear to the quote unquote Aboriginal community. And got actually asked a question by the good brother Tomahawk Tony regarding an inquiry someone had made about the upcoming census, and hearing other people talk about how do you get your sovereignty. So we just wanted to take some time because these things are coming up to give some clarity on a few different elements. So I'm going to title this video tonight, The American versus the American Indian. The American versus the American Indian. And if I do a halfway decent job of making sure to articulate the position correctly, you should have an understanding of what I mean by that by the time we get done with this video. So get started. The American versus the American Indian. And when I utilize those two terms, those verses, really what I'm talking about is citizenship versus nationality. citizenship versus nationality. Now, what is citizenship? Well, Black's Law Second Edition says in general, citizenship or a citizen is a member of a free city or jural society, civitas, possessing all the rights and privileges that can be enjoyed by any person under its constitution and government and subject to the corresponding duties. So, excuse me. The first thing we see is that with citizenship or a citizen, there are privileges and civil rights that also come along with corresponding duties. So, a citizen, someone who has citizenship, has privileges and civil rights, rights underneath that jural society or that free city under their constitution, but they're also subject to corresponding duties. All right. So, that's citizenship, and we compare citizenship with nationality. And that, under Black's Law Second Edition, is that quality or character which arises from the fact of a person's belonging to a nation or state. Nationality determines the political status of the individual, especially with reference to allegiance, while domicile determines his civil status. Nationality arises either by birth or by naturalization. According to Savigny, nationality is also used as opposed to territoriality for the purpose of distinguishing the case of a nation having no national territory. So we see now when we're talking nationality, what we're talking in actuality is territory. And let's look at what Black's Law says about that. A part of a country separated from the rest and subject to a particular jurisdiction. In American law, a portion of the United States not within the limits of any state, which has not yet been admitted as a state of the Union, but is organized with a separate legislature and with executive and judicial officers appointed by the president. We don't necessarily need to pay attention to the second half. This is Black's Law, so they give try to give comprehensive definitions, I think, based upon the contemporary understanding. But the first part of a country separated from the rest and subject to a particular jurisdiction. So we're talking about territories when we're talking about nationality. And we're also talking about heritage. Heritage. And what is heritage? Well, it's in the civil law. Every species of immovable which can be the subject of property, such as lands, houses, orchards, woods, marshes, ponds, etc., in whatever mode they may have been acquired, either by descent or purchase. So we're talking territory and heritage. We're talking the territory, the actual physical space where it's located, and the heritage, the things that belong to the people that come from there. And blood heritage is one of those types of heritages. So, first of all, when we talk about the American versus the American Indian, is a discussion of citizenship, American being US citizenship or American Republic citizenship or whatever you want to call it, but in this US, coming from the US perspective versus nationality, which is dealing with territory and heritage separate and foreign to a territory under a separate jurisdiction than the US or the American Republic, whatever you want to call it. So that's what we're discussing, first of all, citizenship versus nationality. And it's important you understand that so that you can understand as I go deeper into these conversations tonight. Now, let me be clear. American Indian is not a nationality. I think it's a race. And at this point, it's a classification of U.S. citizenship. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that. When we're talking American versus American Indian, we have to keep in mind that both are colonial misnomers. None of our people were calling themselves Americans or American Indians prior to when Europeans got here. My people are Nahiganset, and from particular places, Meshipag, Shomet, Coesit, the list goes on, Nudakonkanit, the list goes on, Uskapag, the list goes on. So all of this American and American Indian stuff is all just colonial misnomers just to describe a certain type of people or a certain grouping of people that they decided to classify. So it's not actually who you are. They're both colonial misnomers. And when we understand that they're colonial misnomers, then we understand that we shouldn't attach any emotional elements to them and just look at them for what they are and how they properly apply. So let's look at American. And what we're going to look at is the fact that having taken our discussion about citizenship versus nationality, an American is just a citizen of America. Now, a lot of people point to this Webster's 1828 definition, but I think they interpret it a little bit wrong. So it says a native of America, originally applied to the aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans. And I've heard people focus on that section, but that's not the section that should be focused on. There's, there's two sections that should be focused on. The first one is the section that comes after that, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. So it did mean that, but now when you use the term American, you mean descendants of Europeans born in America. So when you're calling yourself an American, you're calling yourself a descendant of a European born in America. But even perhaps even more important than that is the first element, a native of America. So an American is considered a native of America. That's what an American is. And we all know what a native means, right? Black's Law, second edition, a natural born subject or citizen. So when you call yourself an American, what you're doing is calling yourself a native of America, which means you're calling yourself a natural born subject or citizen of America. When you call yourself an American. This, of course, comes from a perspective of being very individual and very self-focused, right? And for the most part, these Americans were naturalized. All of them they created their country, but it wasn't their land. They formed their own thing. So it's all through some sort of naturalization, really. It's nothing to really do with birth, even though once they got going, you could get citizenship through birth. But keep that in mind. When you use this term American, what you're saying is that you're a native of America. That's the first element. The rest of it is describing that first one or giving history on it. But a native of America, and a native is a natural born subject or citizen of America, a denizen by birth, one who owes his domicile or citizenship to the fact of his birth within the country referred to. An American, when you use that term, you're stating that you are a natural born subject or citizen of America. Now let's go down to Indian, really. Indian. And we add the American on because America is what they call these lands. So the American becomes the descriptor, the type of Indian. If you notice, you have European American, the type of American is European. Italian American, the type of American is Italian. Portuguese American, the type of American is Portuguese. African American, the type of American is African. So it's all describing the type of American. When you look at this term Indian, you'll notice that American starts to describe the Indian. So the Indian is the term that's in the superior position in this term American Indian, as opposed to Native American, European American, African American. All of those are describing the American, which is the natural born subject or citizen of America. The American Indian, well, what is an Indian? It's an aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas. And that's from Black's Law, second edition. So the Indian and the American Indian is describing where the Indian is at, where it's located at. The Indian is an aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas. The American is a natural born subject or citizen of America. So that's the fundamental basis of our conversation tonight, the American versus the American Indian. Because as we get into this, the real concern is that seems to be a growing sort of thought pattern that you can conduct yourself in an American fashion, but still claim to be an American Indian. And we're going to get into why that doesn't make sense, and why it can actually get you in a lot of trouble. So let's first start, once again, understanding American versus American Indian. Let's look at what the classification for American Indian tribes are. And there's going to be 5 of them thus far that we're aware of. So the first is commercially non-viable. That means you know who you are, people are together, but they don't exist anywhere in commerce. So you're going to be subject. You're going to be subject. You're subjects of the U.S. Next, you have Indian tribes that have gone and formed 501c3s and for-profit corps and all that, and incorporated the tribe as a domestic entity. They're subject. So they're going to have to go by whatever the rules and regulations are for state and local, based upon where they incorporated that. Next, you're going to go to your state recognized. And this is a relationship that perhaps was established with the colonial powers or the states as they were growing into the federal government before the rules were set in place. But this is going to be a domestic dependent / quasi-sovereign relationship. So state recognized tribes are in that relationship for the most part, and that's why they can get funding and things of that nature from the federal government, because recognize they exist commercially in some form that's not just solely dependent to the US or to the state, but still domestic dependent, still quasi sovereign. Then you have your federally recognized tribes, which are domestic dependents and quasi sovereign, and they dealt directly with the federal government. So those are you a little bit um, more contemporary relationships that were developed. And then after that, you start, that's where the BIA and all that came from, because they didn't want to deal with Indians on a treaty basis anymore. And then you have your fifth one, and this is the space that the FANA tribes have been moving in. This is your pre-colonial tribes, and these are considered sovereign and foreign to the U.S. So these are just some of the elements that go into establishment of a pre-colonial tribal entity. But first, it's historically acknowledged. So it's one of those tribes that is acknowledged in the history books as being here when Europeans arrived. When whatever was getting going on, these are tribes that were around. Um, and that's important. That's what really does away with starting new tribes, because if you start new tribes, then there's no historical acknowledgement, then you have no pre-colonial status, and you're going to fall into one of those previous four categories, of most likely domestic entity, which means you're under state and federal jurisdiction. The state, that has to be a relationship you develop directly with the governor or whoever the appointee is, and the federally recognized, that's directly with the BIA or whatever. So if you're not one of those, then you're either domestic entity or you're commercially non-viable. Those are the only other elements. And even if you are some sort of foreign entity, you figure out that route, you're still subject to the state and the federal jurisdiction when you're doing business. You're just going by whatever the state and federal rules are. So starting new tribes that's not necessarily the route to go. That's really not the route to go. Especially if you think that you're going to be able to move in a pre-colonial status. Remember, this is sovereignty and being in a foreign status, but also sovereignty. So historically acknowledged. Next, you have to have the possessory interest in the land. That means the rights to the land. Did your tribe actually have the rights to the land? There were tribes that are around, but in many instances, they might have been subject to another tribe. So did they have the possessory rights to be giving away lands? Or there were tribes that, used to fight over lands, but they weren't controlled by that tribe at the time of European contact. And that tribe went because they didn't like the other tribe and gave that land away to Europeans. That's not necessarily lawful. They didn't have the possessory interest in those lands. So you have to have the possessory interest to make any sort of land claims. And a lot of times that comes down to that. Well, that does, not a lot of times, that comes down to bloodlines and connections to people that were signing treaties at that time. And then it's also going to be on a first come, first serve basis, right? Because if someone else has the claim, same bloodlines, and has made the claim before you, then you can't come in and be like, oh, well, I've got that claim too. You have to deal with them first if that claim has already been um, uh, taken. So you have historically acknowledged and then possessory interest, unextinguished land claims, because a lot of people moved. When you went out, when the tribes got moved, I know a lot of our family moved out to Brothertown. They gave up their possessory interest in these lands and took lands out in Brothertown. Now, does that mean that they're not family? Absolutely not. But it also doesn't mean that they could come here and kind of direct things, just like we can't go to Brothertown and direct things because they're Narragansetts. So unextinguished land claims. And a lot of that times that ties into the next element, which is a continuing presence in the territory. Because most of the tribes that still have unextinguished land claims are going to be the tribes that are still in their territories. Mashapag was still in our territories. Uh, Pretty much all of the New England tribes, New England area tribes, are still in their territories. Pretty much all of the northeastern tribes are still in their territories. Pretty much all of the eastern seaboard tribes are still in their territories. Most of us just got misclassified as something other than an Indian. Um, so continuing presence. So I got historically acknowledged possessory interest, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in the territory. And then this is a key one as well, right? Because this really solidifies, because we're playing in a European law system, treaty acknowledged. And this is what you need to be sure about and understand when it comes to treaties. Treaties are contracts between nations. Nations are considered sovereign. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the nation really has to be the one enforcing it. And individuals generally do not have rights under treaties as a matter of international law, and may enforce treaties on their own behalf only when they have rights under treaties as a matter of international law. And you can look at US v. Verdugo Urquidez and US v. Alvarez Machain. if you want to see some more around those rulings and kind of what those two principles are. But you have to understand that individuals generally cannot enforce treaty rights under international law. So unless there's language specifically in that treaty that's understood under international law that says individuals can do that. And when you look back at these Indian treaties that were going on even in pre-colonial times, there was no talk about individuals um, enforcing them. It was about the tribe and the chief and the Indians collectively, collectively. So in most matters, it really should be your tribe or your nation that's advocating on your behalf. Um, and that's getting into another subject matter, but just understand that individuals generally do not have rights under treaties as a matter of international law and may enforce treaties on their own behalf only when they have rights under treaties as a matter of international law. So if you're dealing with one of those pre-colonial Indian treaties, most likely you don't have individual rights to enforce it. Your tribe has to enforce it on your behalf. And then the other element to keep in mind under treaties is that citizens cannot enforce treaties against their own nation, and that'll become clear later on when we get to the Snyder Act and why Indians got citizenship conferred upon them. So individuals generally do not have rights under treaties as a matter of international law, and generally may enforce treaties only on their behalf only when they have rights under treaties as a matter of international law, and citizens cannot enforce treaties against their own. So we got historically acknowledged possessory interests, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in territory, treaty acknowledged. Lastly, commercially viable. And see, this is where a lot of the misinformation around trust could really get people in trouble, because you really have to meet all of those elements first before you start looking at creating any sort of trust making land claims. Before you have to meet pretty much all of those elements in terms of pre-colonialism before you can get into making any sort of commercial viability through tribal trust that are foreign and private. If you're missing any of those elements, by law, you're not going to be considered to be pre-colonial, or someone else is going to be able to challenge that claim. And if that's the case, you don't want to be caught out there with a claim that's not 100%. So let me get that thought closed out for a second. So those elements: historically acknowledged, possessory interests, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in territory, treaty acknowledged in many instances, and commercially viable. Those are some of the base elements that comprise a pre-colonial tribe. So just quickly, those American Indian tribe classifications were commercially non-viable, domestic entity, state recognized, federally recognized, or pre-colonial. Now that you understand what those are, let's look at what the classifications of American Indian are. So first you have your misclassified American Indians, where a lot of us were African Americans, colored folks, Negroes, white in some instances, Latino, Hispanic, uh, Asian, I don't know, whatever they misclassified people to so that they would not be able to enforce anything. We put them under misclassified, and their status in the U.S. is going to be a U.S. citizen. Now let's look at the next classification. We'll call these reservation Indians, and this is usually federally recognized or state recognized Indians because they usually have a reservation, some sort of reserve is set up for them. Their status is going to be U.S. citizen. Then we're going to have our urban Indians. These are Indian folk because most Indians don't live on the reservations anymore. They're going to be in our city areas. They're urban Indians, and their status is U.S. citizen. And then we've got our rural Indians, right? The ones that are out living in the countryside, because not all Indians want to live in the city and be with the bright lights and all that. So they're going to be rural Indians, and they're going to be U.S. citizens. So if you're misclassified, if you're a reservation Indian, if you're an urban Indian, or if you're a rural Indian, you're a U.S. citizen. Plain and simple, you are subject to state and local laws. And once again, we'll get to that in a moment. Just hold on to that, though, and understand that, because I want to get into a decent conversation about this status of Indian not taxed, so that you understand. If you're misclassified, if you're a reservation Indian, if you're an urban Indian, or if you're a rural Indian, no matter what type of Indian you are a U.S. citizen, unless you're an Indian not taxed. And what an Indian not taxed is a foreign national aboriginal inhabitant. Now, the only way to hold this status as of now, we're not talking about when the censuses were being done. We're not talking about going all the way back to when first contact was going on. Those are your ancestors. Those are the ancestors. For individuals living and breathing today, the only way to get to this Indian not tax status and to be considered a foreign national aboriginal inhabitant is to be a tribal citizen of a pre-colonial American Indian tribe. And you saw what all of those elements are that go under pre-colonial American Indian tribes: historically acknowledged, possessory interest, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in the territory, treaty acknowledged, and commercially viable. You have to be a tribal citizen of one of those types of tribes to be an Indian not taxed. And let's see why. This term Indian not taxed is first mentioned in the 1830 US Census. All right. In the 1860 US instructions, they say Indians not taxed are not to be enumerated. So Indians not taxed are not to be enumerated. Now let's look at who is to be enumerated. The families of Indians who have renounced tribal rule and who under state or territorial laws exercise the rights of citizens are to be enumerated. So hear me. If you are not a tribal citizen under tribal rule of a pre-colonial tribe, you are to be enumerated. That's what they were saying in 1860. You are to be enumerated. You are taxable. You are not an Indian not taxed. All right. 1870, US Census Instructions change a little bit. It says Indians not taxed are not to be enumerated on Schedule 1. Indians out of their tribal relations and exercising the rights of citizens under state or territorial laws will be included. So once again, if you're out of your tribal relations, which means you're not a member of a tribe, a pre-colonial, you're not a member of a federally recognized, state recognized, any type of tribe. You're just an Indian. All right. You're just an Indian. That's all you're moving in. You're not trying to get into the other specific stuff that comes along with being an Indian. If you don't want to get into that, then you are to be enumerated. You are an American, a natural born subject or citizen of America, a Native American. That's what you are. If you're not in a tribal relationship with a tribe, if you're just going to be not there, then you're considered an American by law. Let's go on to the 1880 definition of an Indian not taxed. This is the US Census once again. It says, by the phrase Indians not taxed is meant Indians living on reservations. So they're getting specific now. Indians living on reservations under the care of government agents or roaming individually or in bands over unsettled tracts of country. So Indian not taxed means they're living on reservations at this point. They're roaming individually or in bands over unsettled tracts of country. Unsettled tracts of country. That's the important element right there. And here it goes again further. This is 1880. Indians not in tribal relations, whether full bloods or half breeds, who are found mingled with the white population, residing in white families, engaged as servants or laborers, or living in huts or wigwams on the outskirts of towns or settlements, are to be regarded as part of the ordinary population of the country for the constitutional purpose of the apportionment of the country of the apportionment of representatives among the states, not to be embraced in the enumeration. So once again, if you are not in tribal relations, if you do not have, not a member of a tribe, you're enumerated, you're an American. It's that simple. There's no Indians not taxed. That's by the law and definition as they were enumerating it. In order to be Indian not taxed, you have to be associated with the tribe. That's the point that I'm trying to hammer home here, which is why we said from the very beginning with FANA, once you get your genealogy, go and get with your tribe. Go and get with your tribe. You cannot do this on your own. The system's not set up for you to do it on your own. When you try to do it on your own, you're moving into sovereign citizen territory. And that's not a space that you want to be in if you're claiming to be an Indian. So let's go on to the 1890 US Census definition. By the phrase Indians not taxed is meant Indians living on reservations under the care of government agents or roaming individually or in bands over unsettled tracts of country. Unsettled tracts. Now you tell me where here in the US are you going to be unsettled tracts if you're an urban Indian? Where is an urban Indian finding unsettled tracts at? Let's go on to 1900. In the 1900 U.S. Census, there was a separate population schedule was used for Indian families, both those on reservations and those living in family groups outside of reservations. So once again, that reservation is considered a split in jurisdiction between state territories and all that, but all of this is under federal. And then it says an Indian is to be considered taxed if he or she is detached from his or her tribe. So this is in 1900. If you are detached from your tribe, you are to be enumerated. You are taxed. There is no Indian not tax status if you are detached from your tribe. And living among white people as an individual and as such subject to taxation, whether he or she actually pays taxes or not. Also, if he or she is living with his or her tribe but has received an allotment of land and thereby has acquired citizenship. Now, this will explain to you why a lot of your ancestors were getting allotments, why they got allotments of land. So once again, when you go to those door rules or any of those rules, and it shows that your people got an allotment, yeah, they're Indians, but they're citizens when they receive that allotment. That allotment takes them out of the Indians not tax status. They're now U.S. citizens by law. An Indian on a reservation without an allotment or roving over unsettled territory is considered not taxed. So if your ancestors got an allotment, they accepted U.S. citizenship, you had a birth certificate after, so you're a U.S. citizen. You're only a Indian not taxed. It all starts if you have relations with your tribe. If you do not have relations with your tribe, there's no conversations around Indians not taxed. And then it depends on what your status of relationship is between your tribe and this U.S. government. And then 1920, there was no separate Indian schedule. So they stuck with what happened in 1900, and then 1920, they just got rid of the Indians not taxed thing. And we're going to get to why that is in a moment. But I want to clarify once again, Indian not taxed is only for tribal citizens in this day and age of a pre-colonial American Indian tribe. And that's because they have to be inhabiting unsettled territory. And what is unsettled territory in this day and age? It's a separate commercial jurisdiction because everything's settled. So the only way it could be unsettled, which means not improved upon or developed by them, is if it's in a separate foreign commercial jurisdiction. And the only way to do that we are aware of from a tribal perspective is to go the pre-colonial route. All of those elements that I touched upon, let me just read them again so that everyone is aware and knowledgeable. Once again, historically acknowledged, having possessory interest, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in the territory, treaty acknowledged and commercially viable. And the possessory interest, let me touch base on this. This a lot of times comes down to direct blood lineage to the people that were signing treaties back then. When we look at the Pokanoket, the Sagamore, and the chief of the Pokanoket tribe, Dancing Star, they come directly from the Massasoit, directly from the Massasoit. So they have the possessory interest to be able to say, well, wait a minute, my grandfather, my great grandfather never gave that land to you. You took it. You have to give it back to me. I represent the nation. You have to give it back to me. Someone else who was not from that direct line can't make that same claim. For my people, my particular clan, we come directly down from the Michaels and the Champlains, who come from the Canonicus and Miantinomi. So that's two different chiefs that were acknowledged in the 1600s. So people in my clan and double descendants from Chief Bristol Michael in the late 1800s. So the right that we have, the possessory interest to go and say, hey, look, these were our people's lands, and I have the right to claim them. That's a powerful position. Every Indian is not going to be in a position to do that. So that's why we say at FANA, go get with your tribe, and you should be backing up your chief. Who is it that you know that has the right to do that? Because they're around. They're around. So let's look at, once again, only for tribal citizens of a pre-colonial American Indian tribe. That's because they're inhabiting unsettled territory, separate commercial jurisdiction. They have not acquired U.S. citizenship. You cannot tell me that in your name, you're not a U.S. citizen somewhere. And if you only exist in the U.S. jurisdiction, then you cannot argue that you have not acquired U.S. citizenship. You can, if you want to expatriate, get rid of your citizenship, that's fine, but that doesn't mean you never had it. So if you had it at one point and you choose to give it up, the question then becomes, if you've given it up, what nation are you a part of? And for most of us, we're not a part of any tribal nation. We just have our lineage, and lineage is not nationality. Lineage is just who you belong to, who you're related to. It's not nationality. You only exist commercially as a U.S. citizen. So you have acquired U.S. citizenship. You're not going to be an Indian not taxed. Those who have not renounced tribal rule. If you are not associated with the tribe, then you have renounced tribal rule. You're not an Indian, not taxed. Once again, all respect to who your lineage is, but if you are not in tribal relations, then you're not an Indian, not taxed, because that status comes from the relationship with your tribe. It's not an individual thing, it's from your tribe. And lastly, they do not exercise the rights of U.S. citizens. Now, this is all from the U.S. Census. You can pull this out of reading what the different definitions are. But they do not exercise the rights of U.S. citizens. And what's that mean? A birth certificate. If you got a state birth certificate, if you were born and got a birth certificate, you're a U.S. citizen. You're born in the U.S. That's exactly what they meant when we get to this next element we're going to discuss in just a moment. But if you have a birth certificate, you're born in the U.S., you're a citizen. If you got a social security number, you're most likely a citizen. If you got a driver's license, all of these things that everyone's talking about, if you got them already, you're a citizen. You're in the system. That's what it is. So you're not going to be an Indian not taxed. That is a separate jurisdiction. You're going to be a U.S. citizen, albeit you'll be able to have addressed the misclassification and be in the system properly to be serviced by the system and engage with the system correctly as an American Indian, if that's what your blood heritage is. Now, let me be very clear. American Indian is a blood heritage. I don't really care much about the DNA stuff and all that. I think it's good for connecting you with people that you're related to, but I've also seen it connect people that necessarily aren't connected through Indian blood, connected through another ancestor who, and so to me, the Indian blood is all about a birthright, being born this, passed down from your ancestors. So all of those things, though, will make you a U.S. citizen, point blank. All of those things, if you do not inhabit, if you inhabit settled territory, urban Indians, you're not in a separate commercial jurisdiction. If you've acquired U.S. citizenship, if you're named somewhere in a U.S. citizen, you voted, any of that. If you renounce tribal rule, you're not even associated with the tribe. And if you exercise the rights of U.S. citizens, which we all do on a daily basis, you're a citizen. That's what the situation is. That's just what the matter is. 99.9% of us right now are in citizenship status, I would argue. So now we have that. Don't want to leave y'all on a damper. Just want to make sure y'all understand, so you understand how to maneuver correctly in this system. And we've done videos on all of these things before, Indian tax status and all that. This last element that I want to look at before we conclude this evening is 8 USC 1401B. This is the codification of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, and this is titled Nationals and Citizens of United States at Birth. 1401B states, and this is interesting because if you notice, people like to use, well, I'm not a Native American, I'm an American Indian. When I'm not an Indian, I'm an Aborigine. All of these terms, which are still just colonial misnomers. Let's look at what 8 USC 1401B says. A person born in the United States to a member of an Indian, Eskimo, Aleutian, or other Aboriginal tribe. So you can be American Aborigine, you can be Aboriginal, autochthonous, whatever you would like to be. You are considered a U.S. citizen if you are born in the United States. If you have a birth certificate, you were born in the U.S., you are a United States citizen. Now, this is the key element here. This is the key element, and this is what people really need to understand. This does away with a lot of the concerns you hear from sort of wayward Moors who don't know anything about Indian law and aren't willing to learn. Don't know anything about Indian law and not willing to learn. Let's look at this particular provision right here. Provided that the granting of citizenship under this subsection shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of such person to tribal or other property. So that right there is letting you know that there is a separation of jurisdiction between a U.S. citizenship and a tribal jurisdiction, because U.S. citizenship cannot in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of an Indian, a person born in the United States to a member of Indian, Eskimo, Aleutian, or other Aboriginal tribe. It can't affect their right to tribal or other property. Tribal property is separate from U.S. jurisdiction. But hear that, tribal property, not your individual property, tribal property. And that's where maneuvering through the trust and all that comes in. But once again, you can't do that unless you're in the pre-colonial status. So when we talk about 8 USC 1401B, what it's basically telling you is that if you were born in the US, state birth certificate, you've got US citizenship, so long as that citizenship doesn't interfere with your access to tribal property. If you're not relations with a tribe, you have no tribal property, in which case you are a US citizen. That's simple. If it's not, your tribe is the barrier between you and the US. It's not your lineage, it's your relationship with your tribe and your tribe's existence, what they call standing, and relationship with the US. And what is it? Once again, we gave you what? You got the commercially non-viable, so they don't have any. You're just a regular US citizen. You have your domestic entities, and they're going to be subjects. So they have to follow state and local laws, even if they're foreign. If they're foreign, you're going by state and local law. You have to go by state recognized and federally recognized. So you have 4 statuses of Indian tribes, and then the 5th one is the pre-colonial, and those 4 are all going to be under federal laws, some form or fashion. So you're going to have to understand what those laws are, but you're most certainly not going to be in an Indian not taxed position because of the elements that come along with being an Indian not taxed. That means you have to be inhabiting unsettled territory. That's where the tribal citizenship of a pre-colonial tribe comes in, because now you are a citizen of a separate foreign jurisdiction. You have to have not acquired U.S. citizenship. When your person is born or is created in that other space, when you repatriate and you're reestablished under the tribal jurisdiction, that's where the Neesu's at. There is no U.S. citizenship on Neesu. Neesu's never had any U.S. citizenship. The commercial U.S. citizen under the U.S. that was born there, that has that, but Neesu was in a separate foreign commercial jurisdiction. This is why there's no requirement of citizenship. It's two persons. Indians have dual citizenship. So I'm operating in both of my citizenships, but simultaneously, because they're in my actual land. This other status was placed on top of me while I was here. So I still exist here, but I'm also in here because they created a space by conferring jurisdiction and conferring citizenship. So have not renounced tribal rules. So if you're not associated with, if you don't have a chief, if you're not subject to a council, if you're not on anyone's rolls, if you're not associated with anyone, then you renounce tribal rule, and you're not an Indian not taxed. You're enumerated by the census rules. And if you exercise the rights of a U.S. citizen, you are a U.S. citizen. Birth certificate, voting, social security number, driver's license, any of that, gotten healthcare benefits, welfare, whatever the case may be, in your name as a citizen, stuff that's available to citizens, you're a citizen. So then we went on to 8 USC 1401B. So if you're born in the U.S., with a birth certificate, you're a U.S. citizen. The only way to be the Indian not taxed, a separate jurisdiction, is through the pre-colonial American Indian tribe, and we laid out those. But it's important to remember, by that language, Indians have dual citizenship, tribal citizenship and U.S. citizenship. But it's all about the status that your tribal relations are. If you are a member of a tribe that is commercially non-viable, then you're just a U.S. citizen. That's the only space that you exist in. If you are a member of a tribe that is a domestic entity, then you're just a U.S. citizen because they're subjects. If you're a member of a federally or state recognized tribe, then that's going to be subject to whatever relationship your tribe has with the state or feds, and you're going to be quasi-sovereign. That's a better status than maybe U.S., maybe not, depends. And then, of course, you can get into your pre-colonial with your foreign national, aboriginal inhabitants, whatever the case may be. Indians have dual citizenship, but it all depends upon A, what your tribal relationship is, because lineage is different from tribe, and B, if that tribe is, what their relationship is with the U.S. So what your relationship is with your tribe, and then what your tribe's relationship is with the U.S. That's how you determine the Indian not tax status. And remember, all Indians are U.S. citizens if they're born in the U.S. If you have a state birth certificate, you are a U.S. citizen. So let's hit the conclusion, and then I'm going to touch on one more base after the conclusion. So the conclusion: heritage is separate from, citizenship is separate from nationality. When you're talking citizenship, you're talking about rights and privileges that are civil. When you're talking nationality, you're talking territory and heritage. And the heritage, of course, includes your blood heritage. And the blood heritage is really what determines all of these other things that come on, particularly your possessory interest when you're discussing Indian not tax status and land claims. Citizenship is separate from nationality. As such, American is separate from American Indian because an American is a native of America, a natural born citizen or subject of America, a Native American, which is opposed to an American Indian, as we discussed. An Indian is an aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas, and the American was them trying to confer some sort of jurisdiction, but the American is describing the Indian. The Indian is not describing the American. The Indian is in the more primary position in that particular descriptor than American is. And when you look at the other ones, European American, Italian American, Portuguese American, African American, Latino American, all of those other ones are in an inferior descriptive position to the American. So that should tell you something right there. Indians living among white people as individuals who have relinquished tribal relations are enumerated and taxable. So if you're not associated with any tribe, if you don't have any tribal relations, you don't want to be on the roll, you don't care about any of that nonsense, that's cool, but you will be a U.S. citizen. You will be an American. You're not going to be an Indian not taxed. You'll be an Indian. You'll be an individual who has lineage to Indians. But remember, as of 8 USC 1401B, if you got a birth certificate, you are considered a citizen. So you are a citizen. And an Indian not tax status is only going to apply to a tribal citizen of a pre-colonial American Indian tribe, um, as far as we know. But take a look at that information. I put some links down in the bottom so you can look it up for yourself. Just, think about what we're saying tonight, especially when you start to talk about taxation and things of that nature, because they will come and get you quick. You need to really make sure you know what you're talking about. And you have to understand that treaty rights, all of that, that's not for individuals, that's for nations. Your nation should be the one enforcing that. And if you are not a pre-colonial nation, or if you are not a nation that actually has rights to treaties, you can't enforce them. You can't just say, well, I'm Creek, so that treaty, how does that apply to you? Were you those particular Creeks? Were you who's who? It's all about your bloodline. What is your particular narrative? Who do you connect to? Which is why you need to do your genealogy. And after you do your genealogy, you need to go and find who the tribe is or where the tribe is. There's this notion that when people wake up, because they're not aware of it, it must not exist. And that's absolutely absurd. There are tribes around with individuals that look just like you and me that have been around for very long times, very, very long times, and who acknowledge and respect their own. I had a woman reach out just the other day, same bloodlines as mine. Lo and behold, soon as she said a few names, we connected. Whole tribe embraced her, because that's how it is when you're legit. When you come with this, the Aboriginal folks, you got to speak something specific to the tribe, specific. And you should not be coming back to the tribe with your hand out wanting to know what the tribe can do for you. That is an American attitude, individual focused. The tribe, you think communally. What can you do for the tribe? What are you bringing to help the tribe out when you reach out to the tribe? How are you trying to be of assistance, and not assistance in terms of what you're trying to do for the tribe, but of what the tribe needs? So perhaps the first conversation, before you even ask about, hey, is there anything I can do to help the tribe out? That goes so far. Do you know that? That goes so far. That goes so far. It really, when you're dealing with someone who comes humbly and respectfully and wanting to know what they can contribute, rather than arrogantly and demandingly wanting to know what you can give them, it really gets a different response from a tribe who you choose to engage with. It really does. So citizenship is separate from nationality. American is separate from American Indians. American Indians are U.S. citizens by the Snyder Act, 8 U.S.C. 1401B. Indians living among the whites as individuals who have relinquished tribal relations are enumerated and taxable. An Indian not tax only applies to tribal citizens of pre-colonial American Indian tribes. That's kind of the gist. It was a pretty long one tonight, but I wanted to get that information out there so that we can clear up any sort of misconceptions, so that no one makes any sort of false claims or anything like that, especially as the census is coming up. You don't want to be putting on the census you're an Indian not taxed and you not being Indian not taxed, because now they have a record of you saying that you're an Indian not taxed. Now they know to watch you to see if you're actually trying to do that when they know that you're not. Um, Touching on the census, once again, the census, anything coming from the U.S. First of all, there's no individual sovereignty. Nothing, no document out here can give you individual sovereignty. Sovereignty comes through your relationship with your tribe and this relationship with the U.S. So if you're looking for sovereignty from the U.S., you need to be a part of a sovereign nation. You yourself will not be sovereign. That it doesn't work that way. So when we're talking about the census, and this really runs contrary to what a lot of the Moors' perspective is, when we're talking about the census is not necessarily a bad thing for Indians. The census can allow you to reclassify yourself if you have been misclassified as something other than an Indian. If you were a Negro, colored, whatever, the census is one means to do that, but the census is not going to get you out of paying taxes. It's not going to get you out of being pulled over. It's not going to get you out of even driver's license. You have to be a member of a separate nation that has the standing to do those sorts of things. And that's why all of these people popping up making new tribes, you're all putting yourself right on a black identity extremist watch list by the feds for making false claims because they know who's who. So there's one means of correcting any misclassification that has taken place, but even that, you still have to have a tribal affiliation. So when they ask who you are, you can put American Indian and you can put Choctaw, but there's no tribal affiliation there. So they're going to assume that you're not associated. You're just talking lineage and you're going to be a U.S. citizen. You're going to be a U.S. citizen. However, once again, if you have not corrected your status anywhere else, and even if you have, it's one other way, because that also determines how many funds go to your area to service your population of American Indians. Because remember, it's a different status and standing than Negro, than colored, than Latino, than white. American Indian is different than those. So definitely, it is one means to look at a reclassification. But be clear, it does not confer any Indian not tax status. It cannot confer any separate jurisdiction. It is a U.S. document. It is for their purposes. And as you can see, when you look through the history of the census, they were trying to figure out a way to enumerate Indians correctly. And if you did not retain relations, if you were civilized, if you were assimilated, if you were born in the U.S., i.e. birth certificate, you are a U.S. citizen, plain and simple. Hope that is informative to you all, family. Hope that this information is beneficial to you on your continued journey. And just don't have itching ears. Think about stuff that's sold to you. This has been going on for 400 years. It's not going to be that easy. Anyone who comes and tells you it's that simple, question it. Everything that we've done or tried to tell you from the beginning, we've always tried to give it in the context that this isn't an overnight thing. It's not a snap of the fingers thing. Tribes up in this area have been fighting since the 1600s and are just getting the type of foothold that we need to move forward. Do you think that it would be, I know people don't like to talk about creator or God, do you think that it would be cosmically just for you to hop up after tribes have been fighting for 400 years and figure it out in 6 months and become an expert? Probably not. So we give all praise to Creator as always for his goodness and grace and mercy to us. We are so blessed to be able to share this with you this evening. And unto you, Natawamag, Nitampag, family and friends, I say, Wuni Nakan, have a great evening. Akwani, peace be unto you. And peace Kanash. Creator willing, we will see each other soon. Aho.
Welcome to the Belmarsh Tribunal. I want to welcome all the people in this room, a particularly significant room, given that it was here almost exactly 13 years ago that Julian Assange released his collateral murder video of WikiLeaks. I'll talk about that in a moment. But thank you to all of you, as well as all of the people who are viewing on the democracynow.org live stream, people around the world. I'm Amy Goodman, host of Democracy Now!, which airs on 1,500 public television and radio stations around the world and on the internet at democracynow.org. It is absolutely critical that as journalists, we speak out on this critical issue of press freedom. The Belmarsh Tribunal was convened by the Progressive International and the Wow Holland Foundation and brought to you live by Democracy Now! The Belmarsh Tribunal sits for the fourth time today here in Washington, D.C., to hear testimony from a range of expert witnesses, from constitutional lawyers to acclaimed journalists, whistleblowers, human rights defenders, and a dad, to the ongoing attack on press freedom and the First Amendment. The Belmarsh Tribunal was inspired by the Nobel Prize-winning British philosopher Bertrand Russell and the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and others. The tribunal was established in 1966 when representatives of 18 countries gathered to hold the United States accountable for war crimes in Vietnam. In the absence of an international authority to do so. Today, the tribunal pursues justice for the global campaign against the suppression of dissent, and it pursues justice for journalists who are imprisoned or persecuted, publishers, whistleblowers who dare to reveal the crimes of our governments. From Ankara to Manila to Budapest to right here in the United States, state actors are cracking down on journalists, their sources, their publishers in a globally coordinated campaign to disrupt the public's access to information. It's not just critical to talk about freedom of the press, but it's critical to talk about the right of the public to have access to information. That is why freedom of the press is so important. A landmark case in this campaign is that of Julian Assange, the publisher who founded WikiLeaks, exposed crimes by the United States government, and now faces 175 years in prison if extradited by Britain from the Belmarsh prison, where he is currently being held. Assange's case is the first time in history that a publisher has been indicted under the Espionage Act. Recently, it was revealed the CIA had been spying illegally on Julian, his lawyers, and some members of this very tribunal. The CIA even plotted his assassination at the Ecuadorian embassy under President Trump. Julian Assange made one of the most explosive revelations right here, not only at the National Press Club, but right here in this room. And we will show images of his news conference. In fact, on Democracy Now!, we interviewed him the following morning. Right here at the National Press Club, he released Collateral Murder, what WikiLeaks called this videotape, which showed harrowing footage of a US Apache helicopter assassinating civilians and journalists in Iraq. I want to talk about that moment, that crime that was documented, not by peace activists on the ground, but by the military itself, the footage coming from the Apache helicopter itself. It was July 12th, 2007. An area of Baghdad called New Baghdad. Men were walking by below the helicopter unit. They called back to base. The soldiers in the Apache helicopter, they weren't rogue. They asked for permission to engage, and they opened fire. They killed Iraqi civilians and 2 Reuters journalists, Namir Noor Eldin, an up-and-coming 22-year-old videographer, and his driver, the Iraqi Saeed Shama, father of four. Saeed didn't die immediately. He was crawling away, having been injured. A white van pulls up, a dad with his two kids taking them to school. The helicopter blows up the van as well as kills Saeed Shama. The kids are critically injured. Now, I dare say this would never have happened if 6 months before, in February of 2007, something that appeared in the Iraq war logs that WikiLeaks released had been exposed at the time. Why standing up for press freedom, free flow of information is so important. It was then that the same helicopter unit, Apache unit flying overhead, saw two men below. They were putting up their hands in a surrender sign. They called back to base. They spoke to the lawyer, and they got permission to attack, and they killed them. People gasp in this room, as anyone would. And if we knew that at the time, if we had that information, why it's so critical to have, I dare say an investigation would have been launched. And what happened 6 months later in New Baghdad with that attack that Reuters had appealed for years under the Freedom of Information Act to get that video to find out what happened to their staff and were denied, I dare say that attack would not have happened because we would have known about it before. That's why freedom of the press, the free flow of information, saves lives. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. President Joseph Biden has continued to enforce the stance of the Trump administration before him, calling for Assange's extradition. US Congress and the White House otherwise have remained largely silent. Although belatedly, the New York Times, The Guardian, El País, Der Spiegel, and Le Monde have called for the Biden administration to drop the charges. Today, we're going to hear from an illustrious group of people, including the British parliamentarian Jeremy Corbyn, known we'll be hearing in person and also in video going back and forth, Noam Chomsky, the Italian journalist Stefania Maurizi, Daniel Ellsberg, the world's most famous whistleblower, the critically important Betty Metzger, who exposed COINTELPRO. I wonder if she was doing this today, if she would be in prison. Steve Donziger, who knows about prison, the US attorney, and more. But first, I'm going to introduce the co-chair of today's panel, Srećko Horvat.
Thanks a lot, Amy. It is a great honor to be here today at the National Press Club, at the very place where a very courageous publisher, one of the most courageous publishers in the world and our contemporary history, revealed American war crimes. WikiLeaks revealed war crimes, and Julian Assange is for almost 4 years in prison, in a prison which is called Belmarsh Prison, while those who committed the war crimes are still free. I come from a country which unfortunately had the experience of a bloody war, namely ex-Yugoslavia. And, you know, Collateral Murder was published in 2007. Now it's 15 years. It was published in 2010, but the atrocities happened in 2007. And now it's 15 years since that crime. And I don't know whether anyone ended up in prison or if anyone was charged or convicted. In ex-Yugoslavia, 15 years after the war, some war criminals actually were convicted. Some died in prison, some are still free, some are unfortunately still in power. In the United States, no one was convicted. Some died without being charged or convicted. Most of the war criminals of these war crimes, which you could have seen in Collateral Murder and other publications of WikiLeaks are still free, and others are powerful members of your society. And this is the reason why the Belmarsh Tribunal is coming to Washington, D.C., just 2 blocks away from the White House. It's called Belmarsh, as you can imagine, because we called it after the prison where Julian Assange is still being held. We had several tribunals already, one in London, one in New York City. Members of the tribunal included Edward Snowden, another hero, Rafael Correa, President Lula, Yanis Varoufakis, and many others. Today, we are here 2 blocks from the White House to focus on the crimes of the US government committed against the freedom of press, against journalism, against the First Amendment, and against Julian Assange. It is the first time that a publisher is being charged under this very anachronistic law, namely the Espionage Act, which comes, as you know better than me, from 1917, which is a wartime document. And you think your country is progressive, You still have a law which is like more than 100 years old from the First World War. I mean, I have to say that as an outsider to this country. It's as Bertolt Brecht said, a country is sad which needs heroes. And the United States is really sad if someone like me has to come from Croatia to talk about the First Amendment. It's As you know, Julian Assange has been targeted by the most powerful institutions in the world, by American institutions, by the CIA, by the NSA, and by the Pentagon, who plotted to kill him or to kidnap him from British soil. And after 12 years of persecution, almost 4 years in prison, of what the United Nations characterized as arbitrary detention, he now faces 175 years in a supermax prison in the United States. For what? For publishing the truth, for publishing facts about war crimes of your government, for publishing the truth and secrets about the CIA program of surveillance of you, my dear fellow American citizens. So we are here today, among other reasons, to remind President Biden of what the presidential candidate Biden said in 2020. Quote, "Reporters Without Borders tell us that at least 360 people worldwide are currently imprisoned for their work in journalism. We all stand in solidarity with these journalists for, as Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1786, quote, our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost." Now, I'm not really a big fan of Jefferson, given the fact that the same guy you Americans celebrate even today owned more than 600 slaves. And in the same way Jefferson was nominally opposed to slavery but owned slaves, President Biden is normally advocating freedom of press, but at the same time continuing the persecution of Julian Assange. Today, we gathered in Washington, D.C. to demand President Biden to drop the charges against Julian Assange. If he really wants to protect freedom of press and the First Amendment. In the meantime, while Julian Assange is still in prison, all major newspapers of the world have demanded the same, to drop the charges. The Guardian, the New York Times, Spiegel, El País, and Le Monde. All major human rights organizations demanded the same, to drop the charges. And even the United Nations called Julian Assange prolonged detention torture. I'm honored to be co-chairing today's tribunal with Amy Goodman, a great source of inspiration, and I'm happy to welcome all the members of our tribunal and you, the audience who is here in a big number, and everyone who is watching us today. And by this, I officially proclaim the tribunal launched. Thanks a lot.
We'll move right into the tribunal members. Ben Wisner is the director of the ACLU's Speech Privacy and Technology Project. He's been at the ACLU for 20 years, has worked at the intersection of civil liberties and national security, litigating numerous cases involving airport security policies, government watch lists, surveillance practices, targeted killing, and torture. He's testified before Congress as an adjunct professor at New York University School of Law. And since 2013, Ben Wisner has been the principal legal advisor to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. Ben.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, friends, for being here in this room today to talk about this most important case. About a half a century ago, in fact, the very week that I was born, just a few blocks from here, the Supreme Court heard and then decided the case of the Pentagon Papers, and we'll all be hearing from the Pentagon Papers whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg, a little bit later this afternoon. In the half century that has passed from then until now, there has been no greater threat to press freedom than United States versus Julian Assange. And you'll hear quite a bit today about the freedom of the man. My comments will be about the freedom of the press to fulfill its necessary constitutional role in any democracy. No government in any kind of system will voluntarily disclose its own crimes. For that, we need brave sources who have firsthand evidence, and we need a free press and brave publishers who are willing to bring this information to the people to whom it belongs. Now, in this case, the government characterizes that collaboration between a courageous source and a courageous publisher as a conspiracy. Of course it was a conspiracy. Good investigative journalism is always a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy to end the monopoly on information that governments control and to give people the seat at the table that they must have in order for us to be able to judge powerful people and hold them accountable. But this is the first time, as you've heard already today, under the century-long history of the Espionage Act, that the government has charged this kind of collaboration as a criminal conspiracy. And this is vitally important. Remember, without sources like Chelsea Manning, like Edward Snowden, without publishers like WikiLeaks and the partners that it worked with to bring this information forward, what would we have not have known? Just over the course of my career, we would not have known that prisoners were tortured and sexually humiliated at Abu Ghraib. We would not have known that the CIA set up an archipelago of dungeons where people were held incommunicado and subjected to barbaric treatment. We wouldn't have known that any innocent person ever died in a drone strike. We wouldn't have known that governments developed and deployed systems of mass surveillance without the consent or knowledge of the public. These are all things that governments classified at the absolute highest level of secrecy. And yet, can anyone really say that the public in a democracy doesn't have a right to know or a need to know any of the things that I have just said? If this prosecution goes forward and ends in conviction, it will be a very dark day for press freedom in the United States. The prosecution has already had a chilling effect in newsrooms around the country. The lawyers for publications are already assessing the risks of publishing certain information in a way that they never had before. But let's not just focus on the threat to press freedom in the United States, because this is an attack on press freedom globally. And that's because the United States is advancing what I think is really the extraordinary claim that it can impose US criminal secrecy laws on a foreign publisher who is publishing outside the United States. Let's think about that for a second. Let's linger on that for a second. This is opening an incredible Pandora's box. Every country has secrecy laws. Some countries have very draconian secrecy laws. If those countries try to extradite New York Times reporters and publishers to those countries for publishing their secrets, we would cry foul, and rightly so. Does this administration want to be the first to establish the global precedent that countries can demand the extradition of foreign reporters and publishers for violating their own laws? I truly hope not. And let me wrap up by saying that a country in which a publisher has been extradited and imprisoned for publishing truthful information will be a very different country than the one that we have lived in our whole lives. And let's make sure that we do everything possible to make sure that we don't become that country. Thank you so much.
It is my great pleasure to announce the next speaker, Jeffrey Sterling, who is an American lawyer and former CIA employee who was arrested, charged, and convicted of violating the Espionage Act. Please, Jeffrey, join the stage.
It is an absolute that sentence was held up as a shining example of the reason.
Excuse me. Let's step out for a moment. Be back shortly, though. I'm going to address this conversation. Saving all these